Hello, everyone. Welcome to my webinar, Analyzing the Story Structure of Promising Young Woman, a very important and fascinating film that does some very interesting things structurally, which is why I really enjoy analyzing it. Okay, so now we'll dive into it. My definition of a story is you have to go from A to B. In order for it to be a story, you have to end up somewhere different from where you started. It's not that a film can't just go from A to A. That's fine, but you just need to be aware that when you just going from A to A, you are describing A. You are not telling a story. Describing A can be a very worthwhile, loving portrait documentary of an artist. Going from A to A is a perfectly legitimate thing to do on film, but it's not telling a story. What I do is I break down the A to B to three different levels. Action, which for me is synonymous with plot, and then character, and theme. So we're going to be looking at Promising Young Woman on these three different levels. And that's where it gets very fascinating because it's definitely functioning on each level. Not all films are, unfortunately, but this one is. For more about A to B structures, I have a YouTube video called Make Your Screenplay Stand Out. So I urge you to go check that out. I go into more depth about what I mean by the three levels and the A to B, etc. So I'll do a quick run through of traditional 3-act structure. So here it is. We had 5-act structure for many, many centuries, but as of the early 20th century, that was sort of boiled down to a 3-act structure. And this is pretty much what it entails. There's the first act, second act, third act. Obviously, the second act is the bulk of the middle of the story. The first act is a setup, introducing characters, situations, etc. And then there's the point of attack, which is the event that begins the story we've been brought in to see. So if you're looking at a film that you admire and you're trying to figure out what's the point of attack, you just ask yourself, what starts this story? By the end, okay, that's the story we're being told. You go back and you look at the beginning. Where did that story begin? That's your point of attack. Then there's the end of the first act, which I have come to define as a decision or choosing a course of action. And I find this over and over again in, the successful films, the films that people connect with, about a quarter of the way into the film, there's a choice or a decision or, launching a course of action. And that's the end of the first act. The midpoint then is a shift. It's where everything changes. And then we come to the end of the second act, which is generally thought of as things are seemingly as bad as they can possibly be. And then at the climax, it gets worse. And then the resolution, it all gets better. This is like the basic structure that then the most creative storytellers sort of riff on and build on and innovate on. But this you need to understand first. Okay, so understanding the structural function by separating the action and character storylines. And this is, to me, the benefit of separating these two storylines because you can see how the different functions are happening. In that case, with the separating action and character, on the action line, we have an external event that begins the story. On the character line, that external event functions as a challenge to the assumptions of your main character, kind of a deep internal challenge. On the action line, the end of the first act is choosing a course of actions or launching an external action, an outward action. On the character line, the character has made a decision, which is an internal function. At the midpoint, typically you have something like the first attempt to solve the problem fails, and there has to be a regrouping and trying again. On the character line, the midpoint is an external event, failure or nearly cataclysmic event, prompts an internal shift on the main character. So again, it's an internal thing that's happening on the character line, whereas on the action line is where the external things are happening. And then again, on the action line, at the end of the second act, things are seemingly as bad as they can be. What I have found in a character storyline, the end of the second act constitutes a statement of transformation because what we're going for on the character line is internal growth. So the character says, I've changed. I'm never going to do that again. And then the climax, whereas on the action line, it's things are worse. In the character line, that constitutes a test of the transformation, because I've changed, I'm never going to do that again, doesn't mean anything until it's been put to the test, until it's actually carried out in action. So that's how I separate these two lines. We're going to see how that functions in this film. Some examples of action, character, and theme structures. So these are the three screen books I've made. Thelma Louise, we have a plot line, which is all about being on the lam and escaping and everything. And the character line is about Thelma's gradual transformation. And then on the theme line, we have a discussion going on about sexual assault and how it is impacting women, which largely happens in the second half, interestingly. With these lewd truck driver, theme can show up in very, very fascinating ways. Kramer versus Kramer, the same. You can see all this in my screen books. We also see the separate lines. And the African Queen is the other, and this one's fabulous. This one, every single line, every single point functions on all three lines. It's amazing how this film is structured. Sadly, it's very old and people don't really pay attention to it anymore, but it's an amazingly structured film. Okay, going beyond craft to discover the art of the story by looking at structural patterns. Here's Pulp Fiction. Obviously, it's kind of different doing these three separate stories, but they all have their own, each separate story has its own 3-act structure, which is very interesting to look at. Gladiator, this is one of my favorite examples because these little red line arrows here, the first act done over and over again. There's a point of attack and a decision. Then there's another point of attack decision, another point of attack decision. Happens again. And then finally we get into the second act and the rest of the story. This to me is a beautiful example of how you can riff on 3-act structure and how you can innovate and, just apply it in all kinds of different ways. And then Traffic, another one of my favorites, because there are 5 different stories carried by 5 different characters, and they all have a different structure. I'll just give you this visual, but at some point I'm going to be doing a webinar on this.